Coffee with Thorben. Today with a special guest, Oliver Drotbohm, Java champion and working at Pivotal on lots of interesting things in the past with Spring Data JPA, and now, as far as I've seen, with a lot of domain-driven design and other architectural topics. Hello, Oliver. How are you?
Hi. Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me. It's great to actually talk to some people from time to time in this quarantine situation here. I mean, we're not like officially quarantined, but like everyone is kind of trying to stay home and just stay for themselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, how is it compared to the previous week? I mean, you're normally working from home as well, right?
Yeah, that leads to interesting discussions to people that like have to work from home, like just because of that situation right now. It's still a different thing because the family is at home and the tiny ones running around like downstairs, and it's like there's constant buzz and whatnot, and you usually have your quiet times through the day, which are now gone.
Yeah.
And yeah, but other than that, I mean, in Germany we have a like the what is it the kindergarten situation is like basically resolved, so we can't get her basically taken care of throughout the day. So my
Yeah.
wife and me we basically just pair up with for that. And she does the mornings, I do the mornings, she does the afternoons.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Same situation here. So schools are closed.
yeah.
So both of us are living in Germany. Um, so schools are closed. Son is staying at home. Yeah. It's similar to the situation before, but completely different at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, to everyone out there who's now working from home for the first time, don't expect it to be like this all the time. It's completely different. Lots of interruptions and stuff.
I just wondered
Yeah.
whether it's harder for people to actually start with working from home, like out like from working from an office like before, or whether it's kind of like getting adjusted to that kind of different working from home. But
Yeah.
yeah, anyway,
Yeah, it's a strange situation.
definitely.
But yeah, the general idea for today's stream was to talk about something that maybe not, maybe doesn't cause as much anxiety as the whole Corona situation right now does, um, and that is the article that you wrote about a week ago. You
Oh
implemented
yeah,
you published
published
it.
a week ago.
Yeah.
It's been
you
sitting on my drafts folder for quite some time, actually.
Yeah, you published an interesting article with the topic implementing domain-driven design building blocks in Java. For everyone who hasn't read the article, can you quickly summarize it? So the main
Yeah,
ideas?
yeah. So let me start it one step further away, basically. So when I started my work on Spring Data in more than 10 years ago, it was very much driven from the idea that I read or had read domain-driven design back then, and that had, of course, one of the building blocks, the repositories in like, or it basically spoke about that building block, and I was like always been on a path or on a road to find how to actually implement those patterns, how to actually um, make those work in code, right? And explore whether technologies get in the way of doing so or actually help you with doing that. And like over the course of so the first features of Spring Data were very much driven from that. Whereas like so round about the time when I joined Spring Source, and we basically turned the entire Spring Data thing into a Spring or the previous project into Spring Data and ported it over, made it a Spring project effectively. Um, then the focus shifted a bit to integrating different kinds of persistence technologies, and it's still what like a lot of the work today on the project is or basically consists of, right? There's a team. I mean, you had Mark and Jens on the call or on the chat here in the last couple of days. So there's a quite a bit part of technology focus in that work. On the other hand, and that's what I've been personally always like, maybe even a bit more interested in, is that kind of, I always try to the term I usually use is architecturally evident code. So what does it take to actually write code that sort of makes it easy to reason about its architectural role, right? So like from the building blocks, entities, repositories, how do you actually discover that a certain class actually is an entity, right? And or a repository. I mean, in some ways, like with the Spring Data model, it's pretty easy because you just extend yada yada repository with your repository interface. So the kind of the expression part of things is something that's very dear to my heart. So how do I make that code as expressive as possible? And the other part being, how do I actually try to avoid coupling myself to certain technology aspects. So how do I actually keep like my persistence specific configuration traits, what have you, away from exactly those concepts, like from the repository interface. And I think with the work on Spring Data, we've done a pretty good job at achieving this in terms of like, okay, of course, you still tie your repository interface to, let's say, a Spring Data base interface, but that's a very, very thin coupling only. And you could, if you wanted to be more puristic about it, you could even resolve that and just craft your own base interface, for example, so that you even limit that even more. But what resulted from that, and that's actually where my kind of focus on my work actually shifted around about a year ago. Like, I mean, not really shifted, but officially shifted, was that it was kind of interesting to see how we can actually take this even further, right? So how do we actually find other building blocks, other domain-driven design building blocks in code? How can we express them? And what kind of means would Java developers actually prefer to do so, right? So is it annotations? Is it a type-based approach with interfaces and whatnot? And I've been doing quite a bit of research on that topic. And with that blog post, I pick up on some folks' work. I forgot the name. Can you scroll down a bit, Thorben?
Sure.
I think example where I list the interfaces. I'm coming back to that later on. This is still the problem space, describing the problem space. Yeah, there is this. Oh, we have it. Scroll up again a bit. There was this link to the original article. John Sullivan. He has a blog series basically on describing how JPA is not maybe the best technology to implement domain-driven design. I mean, not being the best, that's probably a strong way of phrasing it, but maybe it's just like some design decisions in JPA actually make it a bit harder to apply these concepts cleanly, right? So he was looking into what does it actually take to, what's the best way to actually improve on that and to design your domain models, and that helped a lot in terms of and that's actually that interface or that type hierarchy there is not something that I came up with, but that's part of his work. And there's been a group of other, let's say, DDD enthusiasts mostly in Germany, which I reached out to at conferences and like on an email thread, where we were basically discussing, okay, I know it's not really popular to for in the DDD community to actually bind your domain model in whatever way to some kind of library, but wouldn't it actually be nice to be able to express the DDD concepts in code explicitly, independent of a certain technology? So while JPA has that entity annotation, that concept of an entity is not like 100% the same as the DDD entity. And at the same time, it's kind of, okay, I can do that via JPA, but what if I'm using MongoDB or something like that, right? So I don't actually want to use a certain persistence technology specific annotation to then express the concept. I'd rather turn it the other way around, right? So I'd rather express the concept in code and then basically by some means get my persistence technology adapt to that. And in that group of people, we sort of came up with the idea of, okay, providing annotations in a very thin library, which is like the current working draft name is JDDD. And at the same time, we have an annotation-based model, so with annotations, and there is this type-based model that I've sort of borrowed from John Sullivan here. And the article basically describes how we can actually leverage these types to then to first of all express the domain model or the building blocks in the domain model, which helps us actually validating the model, because there are certain rules that you have to follow when it comes to designing aggregates and how to design relationships between the different model elements. And you can actually, I mean, there's of course, like you can use external tools like ArcUnit and JQ Assistant to verify that model, but using the type system, you can even use the compiler or get help from the compiler so that you don't need any additional tooling. And that's kind of what that blog post explores. That's one thing. So that expressiveness, constraint checks, and the third part being like a tiny extension of JDDD that would then make sure that the expression through either the annotation or the interface would actually result in a class that's, let's say, annotated with, or that's implementing that entity interface here, would automatically become a JPA entity. Like also then the aggregate root basically, or defaulting some of the mappings. Whenever we deal with an aggregate root, we sort of could default to like certain mapping, certain relationship mappings to like eager loading, lazy loading, that are much more natural to an aggregate than the defaults that JPA maybe applies. That's kind of the long but rough idea of this blog post.
Yeah. Yeah, to everyone who's maybe not that familiar with DDD, it's probably helpful if we quickly try to compare entities in DDD with entities in JPA and quickly explain the aggregate root concept. So let me give it a try, and then you probably have a few things to add to that.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, in general, an entity in JPA and in domain-driven design are, well, not that different. Both are identifiable, both represent a certain data structure. I think the interesting part in DDD is that you then aggregate multiple or combine multiple entities into one aggregate. And one of these entities in that aggregate becomes the aggregate root, and that is the defining entity for that whole structure. So let's say you have an order. That's probably the most used example in that case. You have an order with order items. The aggregate root would be the order, and it would have a list of order items. And then you would model the association within this whole aggregate, but you wouldn't have a real association to another aggregate, and definitely not to another entity that belongs to a different aggregate. So you might reference another aggregate root by its ID, but you would most likely not model an association in the same way as you do in JPA. Yeah, that would be a first, my first try to explain the two concepts in these two words. What do you think? What do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, all perfectly fine, right? I'd like maybe add two things. One is that in JPA, like everything that is supposed to be persisted needs to be an entity, right? Whether that particular concept actually is an entity, I mean, it's identifiable in terms of like the database, right? It has to have, let's say, have a data like a primary key or something like that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be identifiable through that in the business context. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a when you capture your customers, they are supposed to select the country they are coming from, right? Then that list of countries that they can select from is basically just a set of values that is you just want to have that list editable in your database, for example, right? Because you want to change or you want to internationalize the values or what have you. But like from the model point of view, this is just a value object, right? It's just like the country Germany is the country Germany. There's nothing to change about that. And in JPA, you'd still have to model that as entity, and you'd still probably even have a repository on top of that so that you can load the individual element. But at the same time, it's like from the model point of view, it's not actually even an entity in the first place, because it's just a value, right? So there's this kind of like that tiny mismatch here, in which I think this would even be a very, very hard to detect case for the approach that I suggest here, because you'd probably annotate this thing as value object here, and that by default probably would become an add embeddable in the JPA world, in which you then would have to tweak accordingly. But the second thing I wanted to mention, the aggregate thing is basically it's about defining constraints, right? So an aggregate is basically implementing the rules on a set of related entities. Oftentimes that sort of also is reflected in the life cycle of the contained entities. So as you mentioned, that the order and the line items in the order would just be gone if you delete the order, right? So the aggregate root controls the life cycle of the sub entities, basically. But it's mostly about making sure that there is a boundary of consistency in changes. So whenever you invoke or apply an operation, a command, if you want to go into the CQRS event sourcing world, whenever you apply a state change to an aggregate, there's a before state which is valid, and there's an after state that it's valid. And you want to design your code that like you just call a method on that aggregate, and it actually changes or performs that change, and it verifies those constraints and preconditions, post-conditions, so that you're not able to, let's say, like through some nasty SQL query can basically change a row in the database table that would then kind of create an invalid state, actually. And that's something where you might have to group certain concepts, because they are needed to actually verify the state change. Let's take the order has a minimum amount that it needs to consist of. In Germany, we say Mindestbestellwert. So, right. So basically checking that you have at least, let's say the order has to be at least a value of $20 or something like that. That's something that you need to know about the individual line items, right? And calculate the prices for the products attached to those line items. And if you were able to just like remove a line item from the database by some code that issues just a SQL query somewhere, then how would you actually even bother to try to enforce that constraint? That's not really possible. So DDDs then suggests you take the aggregate, you just like perform the operation, remove line item or remove product from that order, which would automatically then apply the line item operations and then reports that change of state, whether that's invalid or whatever means you will going to find for that. And, that's the idea.
Yeah, good point.
All right.
Yeah.
Shall we walk? Do you have any question, or shall we see? Is there any questions in there? Mark, I see Mark is helping out with answering.
Yeah, Mark is already answering questions. So maybe we take a quick look at the chat, and then maybe we go to the end of the article where you posted a few interesting open questions and a general outlook. I think there are quite a few interesting discussion points in there. Maybe we also get some opinions here from the chat. But yeah, let's first take a look at the chat. So lots of hello and good morning posts. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
it's 3
the
p.m.
US
here.
folks. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, let's take a look at the questions. How can I map domain entity to from JPA entity without exposing internal attributes of the domain entity? I searched a lot and could not find a convenient way to do it.
Can I map domain entity from the without exposing internal attributes? Okay. That's an interesting problem. I oftentimes find that there is probably a need for some kind of exposure, right? To, like, let's stick with the order example, right? You have these line items in the order, and they're basically representing how many elements, or what amount of a certain product you want to order. Let's say you have TVs and it's 3, right? So I think you can usually make, or what you can basically exercise with that example is the thing that you can distinguish the concept of the line item is actually something that has a reporting or a view aspect to it. So I want to basically render the order on a screen. So I need to have the product description, and I have the amount, and I have the element price and the total price for that line item, for example. I have to list that. But on the way back, when you basically try to apply state, I mean, how would you naturally or naively actually model that? You have a list of line items, and then you have a getter on the line items, and then whenever you want to add something to the order, there's straightforward way would be to just either pull out the collection and then add an element to the collection, right? It's kind of a very data-driven way of thinking about this thing. You can improve on that by just having an add method on the order, taking a line item. But still, that would require the client code to actually know about how to construct the line item in the first place, right? So all knowledge you have to have on the client. So what I think is a much better way to do it is okay, think about what you're actually doing here. So you want to add, you're not actually adding a line item to the order, but you want to add a product in a certain amount to the order. And providing an API like that, so basically add product, quantity, amount, you basically take away the client's responsibility to actually make sense of that, or basically decide what the actual data structure is in the order to keep the line items, to compute the line items. Because let's say if you have an order and you add, let's say, a certain TV once, and then you decide I want another TV, so I want 2. You don't actually want to end up with 2 line items for that, right? So there's some internal abstraction going on where you can say, okay, whenever I add a product to that order, I basically, in the first step, check whether I already have a line item for that. If so, I just increase the amount for that. If not, I create a new line item, right? And still, when you render it, you still have a list of line items. So the line item abstraction to the outside world becomes more of a, read-only thing where you basically can't change things, but all these state changes are actually applied to the order itself, and it would then basically tweak the list of line items as it sees fit and as it needs. So oftentimes you can just with cleverly avoiding setter methods with that's pretty simple but effective way to actually get to a slightly better model in code, to just start with no setters at all, and then rather think about, okay, I might have getters for certain stuff, but whenever I want to change something about this, what's the thing that's actually happening here? And then rather move to like business methods like add product, comma, amount, and by that shaping the code much better. And yeah, does that answer the question? I hope so.
Yeah, probably.
Well, there's a
If
convenient way
the
without exposing the internal attributes. Yeah. Um, I guess it's the if I want to summarize what I just said, it's not about like it's not necessarily about avoiding to expose the fact that there are line items, but thinking about what aspects of that do I want to actually expose, right? So, I mean, of course you have to provide access to, okay, this is the amount, this is the product name or what have you, but that doesn't mean you have to like expose the internal structure, the internal implementation, or how is that list even composed, right, in the first place? How does it react to changes? This kind of stuff is not something you need to expose, and I would argue that's not something you should expose. And yeah, it needs like case by case consideration, right? So sometimes it would just like require that, so expose that list. But on the other hand, you're creating some kind of language anyway with the code, right? And if trying to get that as close to the actual business is another aspect that DDD is very or it's very important to DDD.
Yeah, I think the core essence there is that you need to understand the domain for which you are creating your application, and then designing an API that makes actual sense within that domain, not on a technical level, but on a logical level. Yeah, and that means you need to first do a lot of analysis and then implement it yourself. That's most likely the
Yeah.
the only convenient way you can achieve there. Okay, Kuram asked if you could suggest how to bring your GitHub library JDDD into a Gradle project.
Actually, we build snapshots on a Spring CI server. There's coordinates org JDDD, and then the artifact name is JDDD dash, and then there is core for the API annotations and interfaces. There is then JPA specific integration. There will be an ArcUnit module relatively soon that basically verifies the structure of the model. So we will ship dedicated artifacts because people might not be interested in all that JPA defaulting stuff that we'll probably get to in a bit. But only use the annotations to then have some tool go ahead and evaluate those concepts to just for documentation purposes or what have you. Yeah. So, but it's just the group ID, artifact ID, and then O.O.1 snapshot, I think. So it's pretty fresh stuff still.
And Matt Hamdi asks, I'm learning Spring Data JPA, but in the last live chat, your guest, which was Jens Schauder, said that JDBC is better. Now I'm confused. Should I go with JDBC?
He's supposed to say that. That's a part of his working contract. No, just kidding.
But,
kidding.
Sure.
I guess you did discuss that yesterday, right? So the trade-offs between those.
Yeah, we discussed it. The concepts are, of course, different. And sure, Jens created Spring Data JDBC, so it's good right to like it better than Spring Data JPA. And I tried Spring Data JDBC, and I think it's an interesting approach. It's a good framework. You can definitely use that in projects, but Spring Data JPA still has a way bigger market share compared to Spring Data JDBC. So Matt, the main question there is, what do you want to achieve right now by learning Spring Data JPA? So if you want to learn it to then apply for a job, I would definitely recommend putting more work into Spring Data JPA. If it's to try a different framework in one of your projects, then I think both frameworks are something that you can take a look at. Spring Data JDBC is, I would say, a little bit more interesting because basically each and everyone is using JPA in some way. But yeah, there's also a reason for that, right? So for a lot of applications, Spring Data JPA or JPA spec in general works pretty well. So I think it's hard to really say there is a framework that is better based on the number of projects and the number of features. I would say Spring Data JPA would be my first choice. But depending on the use case, Spring Data JDBC is definitely something you can give a try.
Yeah, it's definitely a safe bet, and you're not like doing anything wrong with starting with the JPA module. It's definitely not about is one project better or worse than the other, because there are so many. It's basically a spectrum, right? And
Yeah.
especially the relational database space is so well equipped with frameworks that are that help you implementing relational database access. So, which is a blessing and a cursing at the same time, because you always feel like you have what is the best thing for my particular use case. And there's like the Juke library is like I think the best place to start if you're really into SQL and you really want to handcraft your SQL statements. And like JPA is more on the side of convenience, especially in combination with Spring Data JPA. So it's just like it's a toolbox for you to choose from. And then I don't think, unless you're actually have a very, very special project where that particular decision is really, really project defining, then invest a bit of time into researching the pros and cons of each. But other than that, just follow the Spring Data JPA tutorials. Thorben has a great set of videos on JPA in general, because you have to sort of know about that stuff as well if you want to work effectively with it. And from then on, it's kind of like you can basically diverge into whatever direction you see fit for your project.
Yeah. Vaclav said, good afternoon. I have no problem with Hibernate JPA. I'm using annotations to drive framework features. I use interfaces to express business domain. Yeah, that's in general a common approach, but well, you're then still limited. Well, I guess your entity then implements the interface, and that means you still have a lot of technical limitations in what you can actually do in your interface design.
It's actually an interesting topic that I try to kind of keep out of the article, but it has been a topic of discussion within that group of DDD people that I sort of tried to get together for that. Because there's this general question of technical decoupling, right?
Yeah.
Like I want to keep my domain clear from technology. I don't want to pollute, quote unquote, that code with JPA annotations, which is a perfectly fine approach. And I've seen sample applications that 100% achieve this at the expense of basically providing the same code twice, right? So they have the domain model, and then they have their DDD repository, and then they have an implementation behind that, which is a Spring Data repository, so something extra, and then some kind of mapping code from their domain code to the JPA entity, which is perfectly fine if you want to go down that route, if it provides enough value that you think it's the right thing to do. That's perfectly fine. It's just you have to realize that it comes with exactly that cost, right? And you're writing technical and mapping code, which ironically, is something that DDD actually wants you not to do, right? You don't want to. You want to focus on the domain. You want to like focus on writing domain code and not technical mapping code. I mean, there's mapping libraries that help you with copying stuff from A to B. Fine. Still, that's something that you sort of run into with that approach. And what also, I mean, there's this if you follow that hybrid approach of, okay, I have business interfaces, but my classes still have JPA annotations, then I think the last time I checked, JPA wasn't too well equipped to properly map interfaces. Like if you just like have a reference to an interface, then you'd still have to annotate what the actual target class would be at the point where you're actually using the interface, which is a bit of, well, okay, why then? So there was no way of externally describing that, which might change in the future. But yeah, so I see the urge to actually try to be as clean or as close to the book as possible. But at the same time, if you think about it, at the point that you decided you're going to implement this in Java, you've already made a technical decision. You've already taken your domain into a technical domain, right? And if you, like, let's say back in the days when we were using Joda time instead of the legacy datetime, like, was this a bad thing? Was this something that like really hindered you or created less good code, right? Was it a problem really? So I'm very in favor of like realistically looking at, let's say, also the domain at hand, right? It sometimes varies. Michael Pert has this in one of his talks. There's like really differences in different. Let's say you build a giant application, you have 2-3 bounded contexts, like DDD bounded context, or modules, or however you want to call them. It might, like the implementation strategy might vary from bounded context to bounded context, depending on how much actual business logic, how complicated that business logic is in there. And for the, let's say, slightly straightforward, but at the same time, let's say this kind of order example would be something which I'd argue this. It's not like your that line item handling that we've discussed before. It's not something that is probably distinguishing your company from another company, right? But at the same time, it's reasonably complex that you might want to say, okay, I want to make sure I work with aggregates, and I want to use like entities and like repositories, so I express that stuff in code. But it's not necessarily or necessary to strictly decouple that, because I need to write a ton of like tests that integration test my very complex business rules here, right?
Yeah.
So that there is, again, it's a spectrum. It kind of depends on what you're trying to do. And with the JDBD module that I built there for JPA, we're kind of assuming you still want to annotate your code, and it's still fine for you to even then implement these JDDV interfaces. And we just want to make or add less of a burden of the annotations that will be required on that very code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I would like to add to this whole mapping situation that you describe is, if you say you want to separate your JPA entities from your model, then you always have to keep in mind this comes at a cost. Your application gets more complex because you have the additional mapping layer. The mapping isn't something that you get for free. It costs, well, if you use a framework, then it doesn't cost you any time at development, but it definitely costs you performance at runtime. And in my experience, separating your model from your entity classes quite often is not a good idea, because it really puts additional load on your garbage collector. And I saw a bunch of projects where it didn't look like an issue, but based on the amount of data that the system was processing, the overall garbage collector load was significantly higher than you would normally expect for such an application. And instead of working on the application and providing business value, we had to think about garbage collector tuning. We had to think about how we handle our objects. And that was especially the case if the architects decide, okay, before you copy a value from your actual business object to your entity object, you also have to clone it. That means there all the data twice and stuff like that, which from an architectural point of view, if you really want to have it really clean and concise, then that might be okay. But in the real world, when you implement the application, all of that comes at a cost. And you have to decide if that's an issue or not for your application. I mean, maybe you don't need to process too much data, or you don't have a lot of parallel load, then that might be okay. But don't expect it to be a free lunch. Yeah. Let's see, what else do we have here? The basis of the widespread use of DDD is to memorize all the data. At that time, the data of the relational database was processed in memory.
I'm not sure I 100% agree with the premise, but a hard time finding out. I mean, just might be a general comment, right? Not really.
Yeah, right. Is there interfaces like CRUD repository in Spring Data JDBC?
Jens, I replied to that already.
Yeah,
there is. Yeah.
Yeah,
answer.
Jens already. Yeah, there is. Okay, so maybe we now take a look at the article.
Yeah.
And let me switch to this one. Okay. So yeah,
I guess we briefly have to go over what we're kind of trying to do there, right?
Yeah. So probably
let me
start here.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think it's a fine point. I mean, we've seen the interfaces before, right? So the idea of John in that related blog post was to create those interfaces and types, and so that you can basically make up connections in the code to actually, like, between the model elements, right? In this case here, you see that the order is defined as aggregate root, and the line item is defined to be an entity within that order. That might just feel a bit weird in the first place. But it's basically, it's expressing that this type belong, or that the concept of a line item belongs inside the order, because there is this rule in like aggregate design that you only refer to other aggregates from an aggregate, right? So you're like, in this case, the order refers to a customer, or wants to refer to a customer, and it would be a modeling mistake if line item, which is an entity belonging to the aggregate root order, would appear in any other aggregate root. And it's very easy now. And I said we're going to ship a set of arc unit rules going forward. Arc unit being some DSL to actually code constraints based on your code base. You can define rules about your code base, and we can define an arc unit rule that basically says, for every entity that's contained within a type that's an aggregate root, we want to make sure that it's an entity for exactly that aggregate root, right? So we can find those modeling mistakes very, very, very easily. So that's the idea here. So I mean, if you it's becoming pretty obvious if you just look at how the generic types are defined, and it's also explained in the individual interfaces. And that particular piece of code is basically applying just those interfaces to the model that I've described and slightly a bit above, to actually, first of all, express those certain concepts in code, and with the effect of that being just explicit in the first place, right? So that's the thing here. Yeah. Shall we scroll down a bit? Tom?
Here to the Spring Data integration.
Let's scroll a bit up. That's a bit. I think the interesting bit is, it's like already at the XML declaration of the plugin, but scroll up slightly a bit more. Yeah. So the
Okay,
applying
yeah.
fundamental processes technology.
Yeah.
So the let's say you have your domain model using those interfaces or the JDBC annotations. It doesn't really matter. If you want to get these classes persisted by JPA, you would now have to go ahead and add quite a few annotations to actually for a JPA persistence provider to pick that class up, right?
Which would break the whole idea, basically. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think you can still argue that JPA annotations are like coming from the JavaX namespace. They're pretty stable. So it's basically like you're extending object in the first place, right? So where do you draw the line between like extending object and like JavaX persistence based annotations, what have you? But that's
yeah,
again is
okay.
like probably a different discussion. What I was more concerned about is like that you basically end up with stating your intention multiple times, right? So you have this kind of, okay, I already expressed it to be an entity, that type. Why do I have to do that again? So
And
and
that would
that
be the part that bothers me more, especially
yeah,
because
yeah,
I have to think twice. I first have to think about, okay, what do I actually want to do here? And then I
yeah,
express that. And then I have to do a step that I currently have to do if I use plain JPA. And that is, I need to think about, okay, how do I do that technically?
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and if I say, okay, I want to apply all these DDD concepts, then that is something that I actually don't want to do in the code,
yeah, yeah.
which is what I like
And
about the stuff that you described here.
And I mean, that entity, that at JPA entity, um, being just basically a second expression of thing is an entity, that actually even like goes slightly further when you think about the we're referencing or the order ID. If you have like dedicated identifier types, they usually, and there's very few reasons that you would want to do this the other way around, is that would automatically need to be an embeddable ID. So there's kind of that's what I mentioned in the second bullet point. There's like the more you look around, the more you find these tiny things where I think, well, that's a very straightforward thing that actually has to be that way. Actually, in this case, there's this Hibernate specific thing that embedded IDs have to be serializable. I'm not saying that. Not sure whether the spec requires that, but there's a couple of these things where you kind of when you were done with like expressing all the DDD concepts, you then have to do a second pass on, okay, now I need to do like all the boilerplate repetitive default mappings that would want to go ahead with that kind of model structure that I've already expressed. So what I've been doing here is I experimented with like ByteBuddy, which is a bytecode manipulation library created by Raphael Winterhalter. That allows me to that's basically a very simple way of post-processing the class and changing the class right during the compilation step. So with that declaration down there, with that XML declaration, we basically include the ByteBuddy Maven plugin in the build of the example, and then we execute the transform goal, and then basically let it use the JDBC JPA plugin. That basically consists of code that says, if this class is an aggregate root, then yada, 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 do this, look for these fields, find these annotations or interfaces, and then add, if it's not explicitly annotated with @JPA entity in the first place, then just add the default annotation. So it also means that if you ever come into the situation that you think, okay, the defaults that we kind of impose here are not the right ones, you could just go ahead and explicitly annotate your class, and it would just be basically overwrite the tweaked defaults. And with that, you can basically get to a JPA mapped domain model, DD domain model, that doesn't actually know about any of the JPA annotations. I mean, that's still then assuming you're basically controlling the schema and whatnot. So if you had to apply adhere to a certain schema, then you of course need to add the add column annotations, yada yada yada, all these things. But yeah, so we're basically tweaking the defaults for your JPA mappings and make them work out of the box, following the model you've expressed in annotations or interfaces.
Yeah, and avoiding common pitfalls then as well.
Yeah, sure. Or basically, in this case, for the line items, I'm defining eager loading by default, right? So we assume that if you want to work with the order, you want to load it completely, and then basically make sure you eagerly load it.
Yeah, which is a thing that from
Is that debatable?
yeah, well, from a DDD point of view, it's a thing you are supposed to do, I would say. From a
Yeah.
database point of view, yeah.
The thing being here, I totally see what you're saying, and the thing being that if the default of eager loading is an issue to your application, chances are that you're probably better off with an explicit query to load that list of related things, right?
Yeah.
But like looking at it from the DDD point of view, it's like, okay, there's this aggregate, right? I want to materialize it, and I want to entirely materialize it, because the things that are in there, the line items, just belong to that thing, and I want to avoid like secondary lookups, and that usually comes in with the situation that those lists are not growing unboundedly, right? So there's like I mean, how many line items do you actually have in an order, right? Even if it's becoming 100, that's not really an issue. If it's becoming a couple of thousands, a couple of 100,000s, then I'd argue you want to like control, like even walk through that list in a paginated way or something like this. So
Yeah.
explicit querying is then the better tool anyway. So it's kind of acting as some kind of messenger to you. If that's becoming the problem, basically tells you, oh, you might want to improve your model rather than simply tweak the JPA setting just to make it work, right? But yeah, that
But
sort of course, requires a bit of awareness of the two things in play here.
yeah, definitely. And that's a typical situation where you have conflicts between your JPA mappings and the DDD design philosophies. And you have these discussions also if you just say, okay, I want to have a clean DDD architecture for my application, whether or not you're using something like JDDD.
But
And
I mean, what I think is people often oversee is that actually JPA gives you quite a few tools to deal with that situation, because I mean, you can always have like queries that use like DTO projections, like for if the requirement is I need to basically display that kind of aggregated data or what have you. So you actually have the freedom to design the default mappings of your entity in a way that's very much optimized for the state manipulation use case, right? So you can basically optimize the default mappings to, okay, what do I need to actually invoke important business operations on that aggregate? And then rather, if for let's say I want to display the order and it contains 200,000 elements, then I have a dedicated query that returns a dedicated view object that already has like join fetched the actual elements and use that for my display purposes, right? So I'm not like hinting on CQRS or anything like that, but it's even before you do that, it's still a good idea to maybe we just have like separate pieces of code for those separate use cases. Right?
yeah, maybe. Uh, for me, the important thing here is if you decide you want to follow DDD, you have to be aware of this of this. I don't want to call it an issue, but of this situation that the concepts and the general approach in some parts are conflicting, and that you might want to do something from a DDD point of view that you wouldn't want to do from a relational or from a JPA point of view, which doesn't have to be an issue. I totally agree with you. Eager fetching is, yeah, in general a code smell, but for an order with, I don't know, 1 to 5 order line items, it's not an issue. If you say, okay, you model books with reviews and you have a popular online bookstore, then and you say, okay, book and review belong to the same aggregate, and the book is your aggregate root, then this would be an issue because you wouldn't want to fetch several thousand reviews. But then you have to think about, okay, is review really not an independent aggregate root? Then you would model it differently. The thing that I don't like during these discussions then quite often, the discussion, is the review an aggregate root or is it an entity that belongs to the book aggregate root, quite as often starts due to technical reasons, and that is that you don't want to fetch the association. But from a domain-driven design point of view, that's the wrong approach. You should recognize during your analysis process, okay, this is an independent aggregate, and it has to be on its own. Because there are a few things that indicate that the review really belongs to the book. I mean, what sense does a review make without a book? It really belongs to the book.
Yeah.
But if you say
but at the same time, if you can argue that the book might actually very well exist without any reviews, then I'd argue that's actually an argument for not having a list of reviews inside the book.
Exactly.
Right? So, and that would then basically require you to map it the other way around, right? The review belonging to a book, and then you're getting to a review repository where you just say, okay, find by book, yada yada yada, and then you just paginate over this stuff. So, I totally agree with you, but or not, but. And let's be honest. I mean, like sometimes these in the shops that we see, people are just not like fully into this DDD thing yet, and have not, like, let's say, started that piece of software before or with that stuff in mind. And then I don't think it's a bad thing per se to technology sometimes give you a nudge at, okay, there's a problem here that you might want to solve, and it just helps to be aware that the immediate thing that, like, kind of, oh, do we change the fetching strategy from one to the other, might not be the actual solution to that thing, right? It might just reveal that there's something going on in our actual model, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't be the first time that a technical constraints just brings us to the realization that there's something in the domain that we didn't understand as well as we thought in the beginning.
Right.
Okay.
Shall we just quickly skim through? I don't think we have time to go through all of the questions, but I mean, I could, like, everyone attending or like watching this later on, I very much be interested in your feedback to these questions that I have in the blog post, in the comments of the blog post. And they mostly, like, deal with the fact that I'm kind of, I mean, I sort of implemented this stuff, right? It's not that I, like, totally came up with the idea myself, but it's I have a bit of a habit of, like, trying to productize things that I find interesting, and what I'm kind of wondering is, does it, as you already mentioned, Thorben, and what I really appreciate is that, okay, for some decisions that we make, or that I made here, is that the right default? How does it feel to use that? Is taking these explicit JPA mappings away confusing, creating more confusion than it actually solves the problem? Because you can perfectly argue that I want to see those annotations, because otherwise I look at the thing and I assume the JPA defaults, which are like kind of inverted or changed. And then it kind of requires me to have a different kind of knowledge, which is the DDD, like JDBC default inverting knowledge. And it's kind of, might not be even considered helpful in the first place, right? And that kind of feedback would be
Yeah.
the interesting. Like I've gotten like different flavors of it yet, but the more input, the better.
Yeah, that would be
Regarding
interesting to learn what the viewers think. So, um, well, I have a pretty strong JPA Hibernate background. So yeah, I would be a little bit confused about not seeing the JPA annotations, but I also
yeah,
think that there would be a lot of developers who would be happy with this approach, and I think that it would be helpful to a lot of teams that have strong design background, have good Java knowledge, but maybe don't want to get into too many details on JPA and Hibernate, and that then are able to build a domain model based on their DDD concepts, which is in most situations the most important thing. I mean, let's be honest, the technical details normally don't ensure the success of an application. The important part there is you understood the domain model of your customer, or the domain of your customer, and you provided a real solution to an existing problem, and not the technical stuff that we do whole day long. I mean, that's
yeah,
interesting to us, but no customer really cares about that. They want a solution for their problem, and that is something that domain-driven design and an approach like you describe here um, can can really help to achieve. I mean, here you're focusing on the business domain and on solving a problem, which is a good thing. Combined with good and strong defaults, I think it's it's at least an interesting approach. Most likely, it's really a good thing. I need to use that in a bigger model to really say, okay, this is a fantastic solution to do something. But I think it's at least a great idea that we should keep thinking and talking about. Because there are right now a lot of technical details that you need to be aware of when working with JPA and Hibernate. And a lot of applications don't really benefit from that. They would benefit a lot more from being able to have a clear design, following domain-driven concepts and stuff like that. So yeah, to sum it up, I think it's a good approach, and I would like um, to use it in a few projects or at least applications, and then figure out how that really feels after you've added the 42nd entity to your model and
yeah,
implemented
yeah.
the 130th use case. I mean,
That
all
might
of us
that might
knows
be a
that.
difference. Man. Go ahead.
Yeah, all of us know. I mean, there are a lot of things that look great in the beginning, and after using it for 2 years, we say, yeah, well, there are a few good parts and a few parts that we don't like, as it's with all other frameworks and JPA as well.
Yeah,
But I like the idea of really focusing on the domain-driven design concepts, on concentrating on a higher abstraction level, and then getting a good part of the um, required JPA boilerplate annotations and stuff generated via ByteBuddy.
I have like two more thoughts on that. Like one is that you could easily use the interfaces and annotations um, for pure documentation purposes only, right? So
Yeah,
that JPA defaulting stuff is a separate artifact, is a separate thing you need to set up. So and I can very well imagine that you let's say even with an existing application, you go ahead and like look at your JPA entities and then think about, okay, what's the aggregate, what's an value object, what's an entity, just add the annotations / interfaces, and then with the existing annotations in place, you're actually in a situation where you could just add that ByteBuddy plugin, and then find out. I mean, it shouldn't change a thing because you already have the mappings on your classes, right? And you could basically remove the annotations that we basically default for you, and then see. Basically, just remove the things that you're comfortable with, not seeing, because that's a bit of an issue with the blog post I had. I'm kind of like trying to, if you're writing code that actually removes boilerplate, there's simply nothing to show, but like the one half of the audience is basically, well, what is the point? Because why would it need to be any more complex? And the other part of the audience is kind of like, well, how does that even work? I cannot understand anything anymore because I don't see the stuff I've previously had or could see explicitly. So that's a bit of a challenge with this thing, and we try to find a balance here. But there was one more thought I had, but go ahead.
I totally see that challenge, but I would say, okay, that is probably the reason why I would use such an approach for applications where I say, okay, I don't have to handle an incredible amount of data or build a huge web scale application with hundreds of thousands of parallel users. There, I most likely need to be able to really get down into the details and really use the well, all kinds of optimizations that are available there. So I probably don't want to add anything in addition to that. There can even discuss, okay, maybe you want to use a completely different approach than an object relational mapper. But let's say you want to use that. Then I might not want to add an additional framework that adds anything on top of that. But let's be honest, there are lots of applications that don't need that, where the real benefit is that you solve a solution, solve a problem, and that is used by, I don't know, 100, 200 users within a company, and you're really providing business value with your application. And there, I think this is a good approach, or at least an interesting option.
Yeah. So yeah, any kind of feedback is highly appreciated. I guess it might even be just like a question of how do you actually discover the change defaults in the particular question that I had there, right? So whether is there a best way of documenting that kind of stuff? I mean, there's a lot of stuff is in the Java doc, but especially with, okay, I apply that plugin from the outside. I don't actually want to leave any kind of word on the JPA specific things on the DDD interfaces and annotations, because that's exactly what I not want, right? So, but at some place I sort of have to define that, and it's more a question of discoverability than, or might be. Yeah.
Go. Okay. Thorben. Yeah, I would say we already spoke for quite a while now. So if there are no, let's take a quick look again at the chat, and then we probably wrap it up. So what about nested transaction and transactional propagation?
Oh, geez.
Propagation? Oh.
You should have Jürgen on the call and then have him like talk for 4 hours about just that question.
Yeah, that's. Let's talk about that on another stream. Rotjo asks you if you like hate ORS.
Yeah, well, Michael mentioned or I replied to that. Actually, I've been invest a bit of my time into working on a Spring library that it's about supporting hypermedia APIs. So, I like the concept, and I think it actually is a kind of can be thought of as an extension of really the way that DDD basically tries to actually close the gap between the business and code. I think hypermedia aspects in APIs can be really used to make your APIs speaking the language of the domain a bit more and expressing all these things a bit slightly better. But there's a couple of talks by me on that topic. If you want to Google or search YouTube for that, it's definitely something outside of the scope for this one.
Yeah. Kuram asked, from my reading of the article, that violation of aggregate boundaries are caught by unit tests using reflection. Is there a better way?
A better way in terms of what? So I mean, the idea that we're trying to pursue here is that you actually can use arc-unit rules and then execute those by in your test case or what have you. And those are of course using like reflection or bytecode analysis or what have you. You could also try to use like compiler hooks or something like that or an APT or anything like that. Those APIs, I've looked into them briefly, but I've never really gotten very far with that because of the life cycle of those concepts. So with an APT, for example, you get access to the currently to be compiled class, which is nice, but is also for some rules you need more context, right? And you need like all the other classes already compiled, and so it's getting unfortunately a bit complicated to implement those rule checks, those extensive rule checks without the or with those APIs. That would, of course, provide more direct feedback through the compiler. But that's actually also one reason why we like came up with the we integrated the interface-based approach, because that already gives you a few constraints in terms of like what needs to be tied to what and what have you. So it's already trying to nudge you into the right direction.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's reflection basically, but pretty quick as far as I've seen on test projects.
Okay. Yeah, then I would say we wrap it up here.
All right.
Thanks a lot for your time. I really enjoyed the discussions, and I think the blog article and the JDD project is a very interesting thing that at least starts an interesting discussion, if not even provides a lot more than that. And I think that's a good thing to drive innovation in this niche, and maybe provide something that provides a higher level of abstraction and maybe some real value compared to working with plain JPA or Spring Data JPA. Will it be for everyone? Well, most likely not, as every other library as well. But I see definitely value for a good bunch of projects in that. So it will be interesting to see if there will be more about that in the future.
Cool. Thanks, Thorben.
Okay.
Thanks for having me. And
Yeah,
thanks everyone
for
asking questions. Yeah.
Okay. Then, yeah, see, I hope I see everyone again tomorrow at 3 p.m. CET. Tomorrow, Nikolai Parlok will join me, and we will not talk about Java persistence and Spring stuff, but about plain Java. Nikolai has a lot of experience there to share, and I think we will have a bunch of interesting questions and discussions there. So yeah, see you again here on the channel tomorrow, 3 p.m. CET. Bye.